So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sarah Carr, and her paper is entitled Everything You Make Weak, Gay Liberation and Mad People's History. So please welcome her. Just around the equipment. I have to turn this thing on. Locate my mouth towards the microphone. Does that kind of work? The people? That's me. Well, yeah, one of them could be me, I suppose. Thank you very much for letting me come and speak to you today. My name's Sarah Carr. Notionally, I'm Associate Professor of Mental Health Research at Middlesex University, London. I'm also active in the National Provider User Network. And just before I start, I'd like to sort of say two things. I'm very conscious that I'm with an audience who are partly sociologists, so I'm going to probably use contested language, some of it to do with sexuality, some of it does have it's in its historical place, and it's how people self-define at the time. So when I say gay liberation movement, that's how it was in the 60s and 70s. And I also would like to sort of situate myself where this comes from. I'm trying to situate myself and my experiences in mental health services. This is a bit of an effort to situate those outside the history of medicine and psychiatry in more kind of radical history. So my title is Everything You Make a Freak. I didn't add the other bit, will infect and make you weak. And this is a poster from some 1990s UK queer activists who probably unintentionally formed some counter-narratives to a lot of the psychiatric stories that were told about us. And they used the fear of madness and moral disease as tropes in their radical campaigning. These were a group of people that were active in kind of Manchester and Leeds called Homocult. If you Google them and use Google Image, you will find that that's one of the milder versions of posters that they put up around those cities in sort of 92, 93. So they were kind of creating a subversive association with disease and disorder, and they presented queers as a challenge to moral authority and a threat to social control. But this approach wasn't popular in some of the lesbian gay community who didn't want to be associated with those considered to be abnormal, deviant, or in this case, the undead. These people persons, because they wanted to be seen as normal and clean and tidy and worthy citizens. And just as an aside, when I put this poster up on campus, some of my fellow members of the then what was then called Gay Stock took it down as far as I could put it up. So there was already a kind of a binary going on where some of us didn't mind being associated with disease and deviancy and abnormality, and others really, really didn't want it at all. And in their discussion that Helen is going to speak about the interconnections and tensions between mad and queer studies, Spandler and Barker highlight the connected issues of what's considered normal and abnormal in terms of normalcy and heteronormativity. And both disciplines focus on the critique of institutions and the construction of normativities, and I think this is what Homocult's playing with in these quite radical post-campaigns. And critiques of psychiatry and psych experience are obviously central to mad studies, but have also surfaced during the history of gay liberation movement and later what would become queer activism. So does the history of gay liberation activism therefore have an intersection with mad people's history or mad studies? The service user and survivor movement and gay liberation movement kind of were developing some parallel discourses and critiques of psychiatry. They may have become slightly different civil rights movements, but did they reach some of the same conclusions about psychiatry? So just to put the framework around this, historically, homosexuality or same-sex attraction, which have historically intersected with gender nonconformity, and indeed they were conflated in psychiatric practice or seen as mental illnesses in themselves. So same-sex attraction was a mental illness, according to the DSM. And in this presentation, I'm going to trace some of the historical records and documentation of gay liberation, anti-psychiatry, political movement, and some of the direct activism that went on in the 60s and 70s, some of which even preceded the Stonewall riots. And the gay liberation movement in both the US and UK constructed very reasoned arguments against the pathologisation of same-sex attraction and its classification in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which also amounted at times to a broader and more radical critique of the discourses and disciplines of psychiatry. And they argued that psychiatry was subjective, it was political, and it was about moral control. And they also employed disruptive direct action tactics and threats of violent disorder to get what they wanted from the American Psychiatric Association and allied medical organisations. And I was conscious that Lucy said protest is broken now, so I think it might be quite nice to think about when it wasn't so broken. But my question is really, did they go far enough? Well, I'm going to show you a picture now that kind of demonstrates that psychiatry's relationship to homosexuality is perhaps one of the crudest demonstrations of how the discipline determines the normal and abnormal, upon which it overlays a sickness and health discourse. And we're living with this complex legacy even today. Gay and lesbian and bisexual people were locked up for safety of themselves and the public. They were corrupting and disruptive and to be segregated wherever possible. So this is a woman who was segregated. She was, her name's Ethel. She was segregated in the Willard Insane Asylum in New York in the 1930s. And this is a note about Ethel, and Ethel's been a little bit naughty. Patient is transferred from Ward 1 to Ward 2. She is a manic or rather sarcastic type who is trying to pout and grumble and find fault. It was discovered yesterday that she and Miss X, another patient, had been in the habit of getting into bed together, probably at night, but they were found in bed together in the daytime and were said to be having a jolly time. When discovered by Miss McMahon, charge attendant of the ward, they giggled and chuckled and told her there was a place for her. And so really lost didn't stop Ethel from doing what she wanted to do. And it seems to me that she was simply locked up for being a sarcastic lesbian. The grace of God go on. So Bayer, in one of the few monographs in the history of psychiatry and homosexuality, observed at this time, in a state midway between reason and madness, those afflicted were in constant danger of becoming insane, and this required the protection of the asylum. So people were locked up as a preventative measure. And this kind of reflects Peter Beresford's later observation about psychiatry in general and what happens to people who are nonconformist. Their processing in the psychiatric system is related not only to them being seen as defective, but also frequently dissident, nonconformist, and different in their values. So very early on in the 30s, in the kind of what you could argue was an emerging movement or community of lesbian and gay people, there was a very significant fear of psychiatry. And the rather curiously named Parry Sex, who was an anonymous author of a 1932 essay called In Defence of Homosexuality, wrote, "Now that inverts have almost escaped the stake and the prison, they are threatened with a new danger of the psychiatric torture chamber." And here, you might not be able to see it very well, but that's an extract from a catalogue of behaviour modification and aversion therapy equipment that was known as Slide and Emetic. You can see there's a slide machine here, and this woman is drinking an emetic. And what's going to happen is she's going to be shown some slides of pictures she finds erotically appealing, and immediately after she's going to vomit. So there's a kind of reverse Pavlovian thing going on here. So this is what happened in the NHS up until the 70s. So that's kind of just the reality of people's experience in the psychiatric system. So back to what the activists were trying to do. Well, the first Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of 1952 had homosexuality as a sociopathic personality disturbance. So same-sex attraction is a disease and sickness in and of itself, and homosexuals are inherently sick. And this became the focus of the specific campaign in the US gay rights movement. And one of the leaders of that campaign, and indeed one of the leaders of the movement, a man called Frank Kameny, in 1965, writing in a lesbian gay journal called The Ladder, he wrote an essay, Does Research into Homosexuality Matter? He said, I feel the entire homophile movement is going to stand or fall upon the question of whether or not homosexuality is a sickness, and upon taking a firm stand against it. So even pre-Stonewall, this kind of activity and increased politicization and increased militancy was happening, and it happened within a previously quite quiet, conservative US lesbian and gay rights lobby. And they were strongly influenced by the Black civil rights movement, and also by ideas from the anti-psychiatry movement, and particularly the idea that psychiatry is not an objective science, but it's actually a replacement for religious institutions that enforce moral conformity, and the so-called experts are biased by conservative, social, and moral values. So they began with angry opposition to the specific pathologization of homosexuality, which at times developed into a broader critique of psychiatry itself as a discreditable branch of medicine. In 1965, they said there's no valid evidence that homosexuality is a sickness, disturbance, or pathology. And Frank Kameny in 1965 as well was very assertive in saying we are right. Those who oppose us are morally and factually wrong. We are the true authorities on homosexuality, whether we are accepted as such or not. And just hopping over the pond, in 1971, similar discussions were going on as the Gay Liberation Front was kicking off. This is their 1971 manifesto. And again, they focused on psychiatry alongside several other social institutions as one of the social institutions that oppresses and silences gay men and women. And I think these two extracts from the manifesto speak for themselves and speak to us today, I think. One way of oppressing people and preventing them getting too angry about it is to convince them and everyone else that they are sick. There has hence arisen a body of psychiatric theory and therapy to deal with the problems and treatment of homosexuality. That psychiatrists command such credence and such income is surprising if we remember their hysterical disagreements of theory and practice in their field, and the fact that in formulating their opinions they rarely consult gay people. In fact, so far as is possible, they avoid talking to them at all, because they know that such confrontation would wreck their theories. So back to America now, and these are the two leading activists. That's Frank Kameny and that's Barbara Gittings. And in reflections upon the activism at the time, Barbara Gittings said in an interview in 1993, psychiatrists were one of the three major groups that had their hands on us. They had a kind of control over our fate in the eyes of the public for a very long time. Religion and law were the other two groups that had their hands on us. So besides being sick, we were sinful and criminal. But the sickness label infected everything we said and made it difficult for us to gain any credibility for anything we said ourselves. The sickness issue was paramount. So you can see the concern here was possibly something about the psychiatric disqualification that undermined the lesbian and gay civil rights movement at the time. And it was very important, 5 minutes, to take control of their life and destiny from psychiatry. Okay, I'm going to get on to the exciting bits of direct action. I have to go through this really quickly. Anyway, so they got together with countercultural allies, feminists and people from the anti-war movement from 1968 to 1972. They disrupted the American Medical Association Convention, the American Psychiatric Association Convention, and the Association for the Advancement of Behaviour Therapy, in which they distributed a flyer entitled Torture Anyone. They later coordinated careful disruptions and interruptions known as acts, where protesters shouted over and argued with speakers who were pro-pathologisation or promoted aversion techniques, one of which was somebody who grabbed a microphone at the American Medical Association in 1968 and said, "We interrupt this programme and psychiatric propaganda to bring you a message from gay pride." But by 1971, they'd convinced the American Psychiatric Association to allow for gay men and women to speak for themselves on a panel. The panel was called Lifestyles of the Non-Patient Homosexual, and I think it's quite notes the term non-patient homosexual for later on. But they were still kind of active and threatened to destroy stalls selling aversion therapy and behavioural control equipment, and the companies quickly dismantled those stalls. So moving on to the 1972 convention, this is such a scary photo from the history of psychiatry. This is the panel where gay liberation activists started to look to gay psychiatrists as allies. That gay psychiatrist, his name was John Fryer, and he appeared on the panel as Dr. H. Anonymous. It's a psychiatrist in a mask, because that was the only way he could feel he could talk as a gay man, who was also as a psychiatrist. So they began to talk to psychiatrists, albeit being gay psychiatrists, and I wonder if this was a turning point in their campaign in several ways. So this was the stall they showed at the 1972 American Psychiatric Association Convention. So they're presenting themselves and their case, and they're being gay, proud and healthy. And gay is good as one of their slogans, but there remains a question as to what extent this was understood as gay as normal and healthy, meaning that the campaign was falling back into the binary psychiatric trap. In 1973, the American Psychiatric Association Committee on Nomenclature finally decided to delete homosexuality as a mental illness in the interim copy of the DSM. So we're suddenly cured, or only the ones who were normal in psychiatric terms. So it was okay to be gay, but it wasn't okay to be gay and mad. If you were gay, you had to opt for normalcy. You needed to be the non-limit. And because I know I haven't got much time, but I'll read out what the American Psychiatric Association, the resolution they passed, because I find it quite amusing. Whereas homosexuality in and of itself implies no impairment in judgment, stability, reliability, or vocational capabilities, therefore, be it resolved that the APA deplores all public and private discrimination against homosexuals. But they did include another category. Of course they did. So they included this one, sexual orientation disturbance, for individuals whose sexual interests are primarily towards people of the same sex who are disturbed by, in conflict with, or wish to change their sexual orientation. So they opted to still have the option to intervene there. So what I was going to do, and I have 1 minute, is to say that although homosexuality is removed as a disorder itself in the ICD-10, there are 5 out of 66 sexual orientation and gender identity categories that still allow for the option of the psychiatrisation of people who don't, non-gender conforming people and people who are attracted to the same sex. So, really, my question is, in order to be normal and healthy as LGBTQ people, must we also be sane? Are we required to be sane? Must we be psychologically normative in order not to be heteronormative? And as Jeanette Winterston said in her second part of her biography, why be happy when you could be normal? So my concluding remark, and I'm going to appropriate Yasna's divorce analogy from this morning, I think we need to go further than the gay liberation, amicable separation from psychiatry, to divorce from psychiatry completely, and ask the question, do queers now need mad studies for the sake of their self-acceptance, community well-being and global rights? Because we are globally continuing to live psychiatrised lives.
Okay, I'm going to take questions now. I'm mindful that we sort of drifted at the beginning on time, so if you could keep your questions as brief as possible, I'd appreciate that. And I'm going to take a bit of a risk here, and I was curious. This split between radical feminists and queer theorists, historically, where that leads us to today, like some of those tensions are still around in the MAD movement. So, for example, is it transphobic? Like, is something considered transphobic, or is something considered like a radical feminist critique? And so this idea that just don't be mean, I think some things are actually, how do we decide what's diversity of thought and what's oppressive? And actually that's a contestation, I personally think that, so for example, this question this morning about whether anyone can call themselves a prostituted woman, if that's their self-identity, or if the correct term these days is sex worker because it's oppressive to use the word prostituted, to me that actually goes back to the rad-fem queer historical split. And I think these are contestations that I think it's bloody hard to not do violence. Like, whatever you do, however you enter this field, somebody is going to be harmed because of the way that they think is invalidated by other people. And I also think this idea about don't be mean, it overlooks structural violence, because it means that if you're the one being unkind, what if you're actually responding to, like, naming, calling out something that is structurally unkind? Like, so if I say fuck off to someone who's actually sexually harassing me, but in a really nice way, do you know what I mean? I'm being mean, and that's how women get raped, for saying fuck off. It's like there's a fine line between critique and violence that I think is really challenging for our field at the moment, because I think we're all about diversity of thought, but some diversity of thought is oppressive or offensive to other people, and yet how do we keep open space for diversity? That might be a rant.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it is just, that's why I said deceptively simple, because I think about that phrase, do whatever you need to do, just don't be mean. And that, to me, even though I know exactly what you're saying, and I think we see this, particularly in the trans politics at the moment, and the stuff, for example, the trouble that Peter Tatcher's got into recently around transphobia and stuff like that. And I think,
Martina Nikowitz getting asked to leave a space.
Yeah, I don't know about that, but yeah. But I think what we need to do is to keep the dialogue open about what constitutes meanness within certain contexts, because they are all context-based. So what is mean in one context isn't going to be mean in another context. So in the context where you're telling someone who is touching you up to fuck off, that isn't mean. I'll leave it there.
I mean, I think that there's a kind of issue that I struggle with in the classroom is teaching people who go and work with people in the psychiatric system about the need to consider people's humanity and sexual diversity and diversity of gender expression, who absolutely fundamentally disagree with that because of their religious beliefs.
Yeah.
And that's a conversation that just isn't happening in classrooms. I mean, that's just my that's my observation and an aside a piece of research I've done recently about teaching people who are trained to go into health and social care in higher education institutes, and how easy it is for the people who are teaching them to talk about sexual diversity, to talk about gender diversity. And the things that people come out with in the classroom are just shocking. And the chief teachers don't know what to do about it. Because they are kind of stalled by not wanting to offend the people who are being offensive. And I have a colleague who's a gay man who has to absorb quite a lot of what we would understand as verbal violence, because it's his job to teach people and to guide them. But he has to go to hell. Not directly, because sometimes he strategically comes out, sometimes he doesn't. But he has to absorb a lot of abuse. So, yeah, I mean that's an observation from where I am, that there's a lot of silencing and tension around religion and sexual and gender diversity. It needs to. Discussion needs to happen at least in the classroom, because you're churning out people who are supposed to be supporting people who are actually quite dangerous.
Yes.
Sorry, bring it down to practicalities.
Okay, thanks. I have a question from Yasna and then another question back again.
Okay, I have one comment to Sarah and one question to Helen. So, Sarah, when you talked about when you reminded me of the abolition movement and with sexuality being taken out of diagnosis, I thought you'd go a bit farther, because at the moment we have a similar situation with the diagnosis of gender dysmorphia,
Yes.
which will hopefully be taken out.
Yes.
Probability, the history repeats. We focus on single issue and the tracks of single issue politics, and there's I've talked about in the book. Psychiatrist Carr did an excellent interview with trans activists, who talks about this, who says we trans people are going to make the same mistake that gay liberation games made. So I think the wrongness of single issue politics is something which we made. I don't know why are we the ones to deal with it? I mean, to try to disrupt that pattern, but I think we haven't. I don't know how. It's very difficult, but I think it's one of the things on our agenda to see how to. I mean, that was a conference.
Yeah.
And then, Helen, when we were talking about limits, and what you said, I mean, I didn't write, and social accommodation of difference, you focused on limits. And my question is this really the ultimate difference? Is this the most difficult difference to accommodate? Is this really the most challenging difference? Because I think in society now, away from society, we do negotiate and accommodate difference all the time. And differences that have nothing to do with us, but with certain qualities we need to deal with that. And we need to set limits. So what I think, this was a question for you, is madness the ultimately most important business, really? Or do we deal with that anyways, in many different ways? And I just want to say my view, what I think makes that madness difference is I don't know how to express this in English, but I think the family model takes responsibility away from us. So it's very normal to talk about us, to talk about our behavior, etc. I think more than other groups, I don't know, but this is my feeling. We are more than the others, we like agency to be part of the discussion, and we as people, I never say we as people, but I think madness invites others to take responsibility for us. And I think that's very difficult and that needs to change. It needs changing greatly, but we have different senses to this. So maybe it's not about madness as the most frightening differences we have to deal with. Maybe it's the fact that how it has been treated, and maybe we need to disrupt that. But I think that's also very difficult. So I don't want to say this is easy, but that's where I see the difference, and it connects to Ruth's talking on violence and how do we start talking about this, because I think this is where we've been the most silent, and there's a reason for that. And additional reasons are people are also, it can also be beneficial to matter, like inspiring us or have behaviors that you are not fully responsible for. It's also something to matter with knowledge. It's not.
Your first question.
Oh, no, I thought it was a comment. I totally agree that I suppose my talk was too long and I sort of cut off at the end when I was going to talk about the problems with the ICD-10 and the upcoming ICD-11 and things more globally around gender identity and psychiatrisation of gender non-conformity as well as alternative sexual orientations. Because I think I see the situation as being within global psychiatry now. Because in February, I think, the Indonesian Psychiatric Association has pathologised homosexuality. So it's, the story is ongoing on a global scale now. And yeah, absolutely, I think single issue, as it was then, historically, is probably not the way to go now, because the beast is so big and it's globalised.
I can't do your question justice, but the question you raised, one of the questions you raised about whether madness is the ultimate difficulty to accommodate, those are limit. I don't know, actually. I think that's my point about limits working at different levels, and also we all having our own different limits at a personal level. There are certainly other forms of difference that are probably a lot more tricky to accommodate. People who have sexual attraction to children, and certain things I feel a lot less comfortable around than others, and we have to accept also that we're talking about human diversity, and I think the MAD movement has historically kind of said, okay, we're only dealing with these sorts of MAD people. Those sorts of MAD people are over, the criminal justices and whatever. Unfortunately, we can't it's difficult to make, at the end of the day, we have to talk about human diversity and increasingly non-human diversity too, because that's the other issue here is, we're only talking here still about human rights, and we're talking about non-human rights as well. That's a whole other talk. So I don't know. I certainly think some expressions of things that might be considered madness are more difficult to be around than others, and I think that's a tricky thing to talk about, but I'm not sure it's the ultimate. No, probably not. But it depends what you call madness.
Okay, I just have one more question here, and I think this is going to be the last one, and then we can maybe continue discussion in Brexit.
I think my question was so close to Jasna's point. I looked at it up really close, fast, because I just wanted to refer to this history repeating itself, and now that with the gay liberation movement, it was really obvious it started more in solidarities, or more as a broader critique of psychiatry, and then became this really clear gay pride and health need. And with the trans movement, it is pretty much the same, which does not only re-stigmatize man positions, but as well makes man trans positions completely invisible.
Okay, thanks. So we're kind of out of time for questions, so I just want to thank both of our speakers again for that really rich and fantastic discussion. So thank you.
Okay, thanks to all our presenters today and everyone who came and engaged. We have one more session tomorrow morning. We have two papers, Flick Gray and Sarah Go Lightly, and we will be exploring tensions and limits in maths studies with them, and then going forward into a discussion about what next for maths studies. So please come and take part in that. And if anybody is leaving today and can't make tomorrow but has something that they want to be said in that discussion, please write it down, email me, give it to me on a scrap of paper, whatever works for you. I'll read out comments from people who can't be there, and bring your thoughts and ruminations, and I'll see you in the morning.